Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. What is Islam? In this series, we have talked about a number of subjects. Today, I'm going to continue with lecture number 7. It's part 2 of it. We were talking about thematic and structural coherence in the Quran. I've already talked about thematic coherence in the Quran, wherein I mentioned that all Quranic surahs are actually revolving around one central theme, one central idea, and I gave a few examples to clarify the understanding. In the immediately last presentation, I mentioned that as far as the structure of the entire Quran is concerned, it has two important features. One, that out of 114 surahs of the Quran, except for 6 exceptions, 108 surahs are paired as 54 pairs. And the other feature is that the entire Quran is actually divided into 7 surah groups, such that each group begins with one or more Meccan surahs that were revealed before the migration to Medina, and the next part of the surah group has one or more Madani surahs, that is, surahs that were revealed after migration. So this particular presentation is regarding surah groups. As I mentioned in one of the previous presentations, that the Quran gives a very clear indication in one of the verses of Surah Al-Hijr, Surah number 15, verse 87. وَلَقَدْ آتَيْنَاكَ سَبْعًا مِنَ الْمَثَانِي. Indeed, we have revealed upon you 7 which are in pairs. وَالْقُرْآنَ الْعَظِيمِ. That is this glorious Quran. So, these 7 surah groups that one can see now, that they have been very clearly, neatly divided into 7 groups, have been designed in a manner that each group has, as I said, one or several Meccan surahs and followed by one or several Madani surahs. One group comprising of these Meccan and Madani surahs has a definite central theme which distinguishes it from the other surah groups, and thus we have one following the other 7 surah groups, which obviously means that when you are reading one group, you're actually reading one presentation of the Quran on the subjects that the Quran deals with, all of them, but in a particular way, with more emphasis on one particular theme compared to others. In order for us to understand this whole idea in a brief time, I have chosen the second group of surahs, which has the smallest number of surahs. It has 4 surahs put together. They form one surah group. Surahs 6, 7, 8 and 9. Surah number 6 is Surah Al-An'am. Quite understandably, predictably, it's a Meccan surah, followed by Surah Al-Araf, which again is a Meccan surah, and these 2 surahs are in pairs. Then the third surah of the group, the 8th surah of the Quran, is Surah Al-Anfal, which is a Madani surah, followed by Surah Tawbah, which is the 4th surah of the group, and the 9th surah of the Quran. It's also a Madani surah, and Surah Al-Anfal and Surah At-Tawbah put together are both pairs. They are partnering together to form a pair. Now, what exactly is the subject matter of this group? The subject matter of the group is the important decision of the Almighty of ensuring that His messenger, his last messenger Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam, may God's mercy be on him, and his companions are going to dominate over their enemies who rejected the message of God. So it's the dominance of the messenger and his companions, and subjugation, defeat, and the punishment of the enemies. This is what this entire group is talking about, but in a definite sequence. So what we find is that Surah Al-An'am, the first surah, is inviting the people of Mecca and the surroundings to have faith in the Quran, in the Prophet, and to leave their polytheistic ways. This surah is followed by Surah Al-Araf, which is warning the people who have been invited to have faith that if they are not going to heed to this invitation and are going to continue to reject the Almighty's message and insist on their polytheistic ways, they are going to be punished. They are going to be annihilated. The third surah of the group, Surah Al-Anfal, is preparing believers to make sure that they are there, ready for implementing the Almighty's decision to punish those who have rejected the message of the Almighty. So it's a surah of preparation. And finally, Surah Tawbah is the surah of punishment. The Almighty's punishment that was promised is ultimately implemented, and the surah describes that implementation. So if you look at these four surahs in their sequence, they're actually following a certain pattern and enabling the basic subject matter to reach its climax logically. Surah Al-An'am, the first surah, is invitation. Surah Al-Araf, the second surah, is warning. Surah Al-Anfal, the third surah, is preparation. And Surah Tawbah, the fourth surah, is punishment. Now let's have a look at each of these surahs one by one in a little more detail. Surah Al-An'am invites the people of Mecca and the surroundings, those who were the children of Ismail, those who were the fellow nationals of the Prophet, may God's mercy be on him. They belonged to the same group, the same tribe, the same nation. They have been invited to believe in the message of God that has come to them in their own language, to acknowledge the fact that this message is the ultimate truth from God, to do away with and leave their wrong, misleading ways of polytheism, idolatry, and many other practices associated with them, and to run their affairs in accordance with the invitation that was extended by Abraham, their ancestor, to his people. So basically, this surah is actually inviting the people of Mecca to accept the message of God and to do it properly and sincerely. Therefore, we find that this surah is inviting the people of Mecca through arguments which are natural arguments, the arguments which are based on the phenomena of nature, the arguments which are based on the history and the background of the Arabs. It talks about Abraham's invitation to his nation and talks about the fact that he was completely devoted to Tawheed, monotheism, the unity of God. So it also talks about the fact that the people of Mecca should do away with the religious innovations that they had come up with, which were based on their polytheistic thinking. So the Quran talks about those innovations and asks the people of Mecca to come to the straight path of the Almighty. So it's a very effective invitation given to the people of the Arabian Peninsula in general and the people of Mecca in particular. This surah is followed by Surah Al-Araf, which is the 7th surah, and it's again inviting the people of the Arabian Peninsula, the polytheists, to mend their ways, to correct their approach towards God's religion and to accept God's message. But in this case, what we find is that the tone is stern. And apart from the invitation that has been extended to them, they are now being warned that if they are not going to accept the Almighty's message beyond a certain deadline, they are going to perish. God's punishment is going to visit them. It's going to be inflicted upon them one way or the other. In order for this message to get across to the people effectively, the Quran talks about the stories of 6 messengers, 6 Rasul. Those 6 messengers have been mentioned in the Quran several times in other surahs as well. Those 6 messengers are Noah, Nuh, Hud, Saleh, Lut, Lot, Shuaib, and Musa, Moses, alayhimus salam. Their stories that appear one after the other in a chronological order all end up culminate in the mention that after the nations rejected the message of God that came through to them from His prophets, His messengers, these nations were destroyed. They were punished by the Almighty through generally one natural calamity or another. So the idea is that if these nations were punished because they rejected the message that came to them from their respective messengers, Rasul, why would not this nation, which was receiving this message directly from the messenger of God, why is it not going to be punished likewise? After this second surah, which is warning the people of Mecca and of the Arabian Peninsula of serious dire consequences, the third surah, Surah Al-Anfal, which is a Madinan surah, is preparing believers to become eligible to be the tools of the Almighty's decision to implement His punishment, to inflict His punishment. What it means is that the punishment that comes from God to the people who reject His messengers can take one of the 2 forms. Those punishments could either be in the form of one natural calamity or another, which was the case with most of the nations that were destroyed earlier, and punishment can also take the form of the military might of the companions of the messenger that would be employed by the Almighty in order for implementing His decision to destroy the nation, to punish the nation that had knowingly, deliberately rejected the Almighty's message. In the case of the last messenger of God, may Allah's mercy be on him, this second possibility, second option was adopted. The reason was that in his case, his followers were large in number. In the case of most of the earlier prophets, earlier messengers, the followers were very few in numbers, and therefore the Almighty went for the option of natural calamities to implement His decision to destroy the enemies of the messenger and those who rejected the Almighty's message. Now, in order to prepare believers for that purpose, essentially there were 3 things that were done through Surah Al-Anfal, which are mentioned in Surah Al-Anfal. Number 1, believers have been made to understand that they have a very important role to play. They have to discharge what the Almighty has decided to implement through their own hands, through their own swords. This would not happen unless they become eligible for it. They behave in a manner that the Almighty picks them for this important honorable task. That is, the Almighty is asking them to be morally and spiritually upright. They should do away with their weaknesses. That's why what we find is that the very first verse of Surah Al-Anfal is telling believers that the spoils of war have got nothing to do with you. You fight for the sake of God. You don't fight for these material worldly benefits. That's one thing. The second thing this surah is doing is that it's requiring believers to also be prepared militarily. So that the Quran talks about the fact towards the end of the surah that believers should prepare themselves, their military might, should be ready with their horses, their swords and everything else, so that they are making sure that the enemy is properly warned and is scared of the fact that believers are getting prepared to have a go at them and to be at war with them. The third thing that this Surah Al-Anfal is doing is that it mentions the Battle of Badr, the battle that got rid of the most prominent 70 leaders of Quraysh, the leaders who were actually a wall between the message of God and the ordinary people of Mecca and the Arabian Peninsula. They were the ones who were so strong in their influence on others because of the position that they held, that they would not let people listen to the message of God. So they were an impediment. They had actually become a wall that was preventing people from receiving the message of God and considering it with an open mind. So what the Almighty did was that after giving a very clear, convincing warning to these leaders of Quraysh and letting them know about what the truth from God is, when they rejected this message, they were all eliminated in one go in Battle of Badr. And the Almighty made sure that in that battle, which happens to be the only battle in the history of battles that saw only the generals getting killed and no ordinary soldier got killed. So that was very unique about the Battle of Badr because it was serving a definite purpose. What we also find in this surah is that the Almighty is clarifying that when this battle was taking place, it wasn't that believers were killing non-believers. That's what the naked eye was apparently watching. But the Almighty clarifies, فَلَمْ تَقْتُلُوهُمْ, believers, you didn't kill them. وَلَكِنَّ اللَّهَ قَتَلَهُمْ. In fact, instead it was God who killed them. And then the Prophet is addressed and the Almighty says, وَمَا رَمَيْتَ إِذْ رَمَيْتَ. And O Prophet, you did not throw pebbles at them when you threw them. وَلَكِنَّ اللَّهَ رَمَى. Instead it was God who threw those pebbles at them. That is, in the battle it is said that the Prophet, he picked a few pebbles and he threw at the enemy and it turned into a storm. And the Almighty clarifies that this happened because God, He ensured that that's how it should become. So, all in all, Surah Al-Anfal is the surah of preparation. Surah Tawbah, the next surah, which is the partner surah of Al-Anfal, after preparation is the culmination, the ultimate implementation of the Almighty's plan, that is punishment. So, Surah At-Tawbah is the surah of punishment. That is why it's the only surah which doesn't begin with Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim, because while in Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim what we find is the mention of God's attributes of Ar-Rahman and Ar-Rahim, His mercy is most profound, His kindness is forever. The mention of the surah is actually saying something which is not consistent with these attributes. So the mention of these attributes has been eliminated. What we find in this surah is therefore that there are three groups of enemies of kuffar, of those people who rejected the truth, who have been mentioned one after the other, and all of them have been taken care of. First, al-mushrikeen, the polytheists, in the first 28 verses. Then, the people of the book, the Jews and the Christians, an-Nasara. And last but not the least, the hypocrites, al-munafiqeen. So, each group has been mentioned, and the Almighty is mentioning that they are going to be taken to task, they are going to be punished, and their punishment has been described. About the polytheists, the Almighty mentions that after the sacred months are over, kill them wherever you find them. And the Almighty clarifies in verse 14, this is because God is punishing them. يُعَذِّبْهُمُ اللَّهُ بِأَيْدِيكُمْ. O believers, God is going to punish them through your hands, through your swords. In verse 29, the Almighty is asking believers to fight against the people of the book until such time that they are prepared to give jizya, or the protection tax, with their own hands, and they are willing to live as smaller citizens, second-rate citizens. That was their punishment. The people of the book were not required to be killed. They were allowed to survive, provided they accept their position as second-rate citizens. The third part of the surah, which is the longest part of the surah, is actually talking about how the Almighty dealt with the hypocrites. The idea was that they were required to go through different trials so as to establish as to whether they are believers, true believers, or they are hypocrites. And there were many such incidents that took place where it became absolutely clear that some of the people who were claiming to be believers were actually hypocrites. So all in all, this surah is a surah of punishment. And when we look at these four surahs together, what we find is that they are all serving one purpose in a logical sequence, one after the other. Surah Al-An'am is inviting the people of the Arabian Peninsula to believe. Surah Al-A'raf is warning the same people of dire consequences of punishment if they would not believe. Surah Al-Anfal is preparing believers to be the tools of the Almighty to inflict His punishment that was promised in Surah Al-A'raf. And Surah At-Tawbah is describing the punishment that was inflicted upon the people who rejected the message that came to them from the last messenger of Allah. May Allah's mercy be on him. So that's how this whole group is completed. And likewise, we find in all other groups, surah groups, that all surahs are neatly, intelligently arranged in a manner that they are serving one central theme, and they come in a logical and also chronological sequence. I will inshallah come up with the next topic in the next lecture. I hope you will join me then as well. May Allah Almighty enable us to understand the truth and to be able to follow it.